Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Climate Change in National Parks. My name is Bethany Cox, and I help fundraise here at Wild Rivers Conservancy. Since we've had a couple technical difficulties, I'm looking for a thumbs up or anything in the chat that just lets us know that you can see us, that you can hear us, and I will continue on here with welcoming everyone. It's going to be my job to be in the background here for Jesse, moderating with the chat and helping with any technical questions we might have during this session. There's a couple housekeeping things because there always is. On the right side of your screen, you will see your chat box. To keep things simple, chat is where you can share your questions and your comments. Perfect. We will have time at the end of the presentation for your questions. So as they come to you throughout Jesse's presentation, make sure that you drop those there into the chat. We are recording, and this recording will be made available on the Conservancy's YouTube account within the next week or so. So now I'd like to welcome Jesse Gates. He is the education specialist with Voyageurs Conservancy, and he's going to talk with us about climate change in national parks. Take it away, Jesse.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining. Again, my name is Jesse. I work for the Voyageurs Conservancy. We're the official nonprofit partner for a place known as Voyageurs National Park. And before we dive into it, I do like to start it off with a land acknowledgement. As Voyageurs National Park, you can see on this map, circled in red, is on the traditional homelands of the Ojibwe people, who continue to live on this day, live in this land to this day. And we can see specifically this is home to the Boys Fort Band. So we see the state of Minnesota here. We see several different bands of Ojibwe, but Voyageurs National Park resides within the Boys Fort band, the traditional lands of the Boys Fort. And this land has current and historical significance to the Ojibwe people. And a lot of the knowledge that we have today, including just the things about the plants, the navigation, and the skills that were used in this land is now stems from indigenous knowledge. So we do like to acknowledge that. As far as where the park is located, we can see this map of the United States, and we can see right up here, this red pin designates Voyageurs National Park. So maybe you can see where you're located on the map and then compare it. You'll notice we're way, way, way at the top of the state of Minnesota. And if you know anything about Minnesota, you'll know that we are known for our lakes. It's a big thing about Minnesota, and we've got tons of lakes in Voyageurs National Park. So it's a great place to get out on a boat, whether it's a houseboat or a tour boat or a pontoon, or maybe you like kayaking or canoeing, getting out and camping or backpacking. I know that those are some of my favorite things. And I do like to clarify, I work with Voyageurs Conservancy, which is the official nonprofit partner for this place known as Voyageurs National Park. That means we support them in many ways. And it can be nicely summed up by our mission statement, which is to connect people to Voyageurs National Park, enhance the visitor experience, and protect the park for present and future generations. Now, as far as how we fulfill that mission, myself, as the education specialist, what I do specifically is I work with school groups, I work with the public, we deliver hands-on programs that highlights the importance of the park and highlight ways that we can work to protect it as well. So going back to our mission statement, you'll notice that it says to protect the park for present and future generations. And this does tie into the theme of today's presentation, which is climate change, because climate change is in really direct opposition to our mission statement, which is why it's so important to talk about. And so again, today's presentation is all about climate change and climate change in national parks. And to kind of provide a mental map of where we will be going throughout this talk, we have this nice slide over here. We'll talk about what climate change is, how does it happen, why does it matter, and then talk a little bit about some solutions. specifically what national parks are doing. So now that we have a mental map of where we will be going throughout this presentation, let's dive right into it. So the first thing is, what is climate change? Climate change is the increase in global temperature over many years. And so what we're looking at on this graph here, we see on the bottom, it has the years. And on this part, or the y-axis, it has degrees in Celsius and also Fahrenheit up here. And so what we'll notice, again, climate change is the rise in global temperature over many years. And so that's exactly what this graph is indicating. We see right around the 1920s or the Industrial Revolution that the average temperature goes up and up and up and up. Again, this is an average temperature. So it's taking the average over temperatures every day for many years. So, if it's hot today and it's cold tomorrow and it's hot the next day, and it's taking the average of all those. And we can see that the trend is that it's going up and up and up and up and up, really at alarming rates. And you'll notice that 2023, it really, really peaked out. We don't have 2024 on here yet, of course, because we are experiencing it now. And you'll notice here, I'm going to go to Fahrenheit because that's what I know more comfortably, that it's jumped almost 3 degrees, 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit, which to you might not sound like a lot, but we'll notice that this jump in temperature actually has extreme repercussions. And to really drive the point home, the top 10 hottest global years on record, we can see are 14, 18, 21, 22, 15, 17, 19, 2016, and 2023 being the hottest year on record. And so it really is something to pay attention to. In fact, many of you tuning in might have been alive throughout every single one of these years. So how does it happen? This may be something you've heard about in school or maybe in your community, but a great way to think about climate change is this metaphor of the heat trapping blanket. And so we've all been under a blanket before. You might be wondering, how does this relate to global climate change? We'll find out in just a moment, but we're going to take it step by step by step. First, we're going to introduce ourselves to this molecule known as carbon dioxide, or CO2. So if I say carbon dioxide or if I say CO2 throughout this presentation, just know that it means the same thing. So molecules, if you weren't aware, are little tiny particles and they make up pretty much everything. And carbon dioxide is the molecule that we will talk about a lot when talking about climate change. And the reason for that is that carbon dioxide is emitted into the atmosphere and it kind of lingers up there, creating this blanket. And the way that it's created is from a lot of things that we use in the modern day. So when we burn a type of material known as fossil fuels to create plastic or to create the gas that fuels a lot of our different types of transportation, our electricity and power plants, when these things are created, it burns this material that emits carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, where it floats up and floats up and floats up, and it starts to gather around our planet like a blanket. And so what happens is when heat from the sun enters, it's able to enter easily, it warms up our planet, and ideally it will bounce off and escape. We want some of that heat, but we also want some of it to escape. And so as more and more of this carbon dioxide is generated and it's emitted into the atmosphere, it starts to collect and collect and collect. And so this is what I mean by the heat trapping blanket. We can see two versions of Earth over here with two blankets. We have a thinner blanket over here on the left. And so this one allows heat to come in and a little bit to escape. But on the other version, we have a thick blanket. And a thick blanket traps more heat, which causes more warming on Earth. And so you can think of it, when we emit more carbon dioxide into the air, But essentially what we're doing is thickening that blanket. We're making that blanket thicker and thicker and thicker. And so, of course, that means that the planet is going to warm, and there are some repercussions to that. And unlike a real blanket, which when we're too hot under it, we can just take it off, the heat trapping blanket that surrounds our planet from the excessive amounts of carbon dioxide takes a little bit more work. One other thing I like to distinguish the difference between when talking about how climate change happens is the difference between regular carbon dioxide and rampant carbon dioxide. Rampant, if you don't know what that word means, it just means something that is kind of flourishing, but in a really bad way, a really unwelcomed way. Yeah, think of it as something that's kind of out of control. And so the reason I like to bring this up is because carbon dioxide on its own is not a bad thing. And in fact, there are many regular, or in other words, natural ways that carbon dioxide is generated. Take, for instance, ourselves and all living things. We actually release carbon dioxide. And so what's happening is when we breathe in oxygen in the air, we're taking in that oxygen, and when we breathe out, we are releasing carbon dioxide. And at first you might say, hey, that's really bad. We're contributing to that heat trapping blanket. We're making it warmer and warmer. But thankfully for us, we have our friends, the plants. And plants do their kind of breathing in the opposite direction. So they are actually taking in carbon dioxide through photosynthesis. They're drawing in carbon dioxide and they're breathing out oxygen. And so you can see people and plants kind of have this beautiful relationship with each other. And really, I say people, but really it's all living things that breathe in oxygen and take out carbon dioxide. We balance each other out. Again, it's a really beautiful relationship that we have with plants. Other forms of regular carbon dioxide, or natural, is from gases found in eruptions from volcanoes, as well as decaying or dead material, whether it's from plants or animals. So these are all regular or natural ways that carbon dioxide is released into the atmosphere. Rampant carbon dioxide, on the other hand, is what we've talked about before. A lot of things that we use in the modern day, the burning of material to create our plastics, to fuel our transportation, for electricity. These are rampant carbon dioxide examples. And so we can kind of see regular versus rampant side by side. And you might be saying, why is one of these okay and the other one is not okay? Well, it all comes to this beautiful thing that we call the carbon cycle. And I know there's a lot of text and a lot of images here, but we'll kind of take it step by step. The idea behind the carbon cycle is that when carbon is released, there is a natural way for it to be taken back in, so it doesn't accumulate too much in the atmosphere. And so this is what regular carbon dioxide operates under. And you'll see here plants and this thing that says wetlands over here in the corner. These are like the main players. We really want them on our team because what they're doing is they're taking carbon dioxide from the air, that stuff that is thickening the blanket, and it is bringing it in, and through photosynthesis, it is storing it inside the plant. So it's extracting or taking it from the atmosphere. And so the carbon cycle operates fairly well under regular or natural carbon dioxide emissions. But in the center of this graph, and I'll zoom in over here, we have fossil fuel emissions. So again, this is the rampant carbon dioxide, and it is dumping and dumping and dumping more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So I've put it in red over here. And so again, this was a cycle that naturally kind of runs on its own through the regular carbon dioxide. But what we are doing is we are overwhelming the system. We are overwhelming the cycle that was once in balance, and we're adding too much carbon dioxide. The plants can't keep up with it. And you'll also I circled the plants to really show that they're the main player here. In addition to adding extra carbon dioxide into the air, we're doing another bad thing, which is we are removing tons of plants and tons of wetlands. For example, through deforestation, which is the clear cutting of huge swaths of land, removing the trees that we really need to help us out in removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And for this next section, I do want to kind of turn it to you guys. I want to ask a question to you so you can prepare to type in the chat. And for this section, I want to talk about why all this matters. So we learned what climate change is. We learned the mechanisms responsible for making it happen. But we have to turn our attention to why is it important? Why should you care about climate change? So if you have an answer, type it into your chat right now. And to kind of give some context behind this, a lot of the issues with climate change kind of speed up the process in a lot of natural disasters that we see across the globe. And this is just a few different examples. The drier climates lead to more devastating wildfires. Of course, the glaciers are melting, which that water goes into the ocean and contributes to sea level rise and flooding. And so I want to just ask this as a question to all of you. Why should we care about this? What is our responsibility to, to care about this issue?
It looks like we have people typing, Jesse, so give us just a few more seconds if you can.
Sure thing. Yeah, we could take a minute or two, however long it takes. Thank you.
Yes.
All right, so as we're typing our answers, I'll kind of mention some of the thoughts that I have and that are commonly brought up when I do ask this question, which is, oh, I see a great answer there. So we don't live in a world of heat. Yeah, there are a number of repercussions to having an overheated world. And a big part of it, you think about these landscapes being undergoing all of these natural disasters, which are accelerated by the conditions of climate change. Well, think about who is living there. It's animals and the delicate ecosystem, and within that is humans as well. We are part of nature. And so we see all of the different animals that live in these environments, both wildlife and humans, are being impacted by climate change. Yeah, and I see some good answers. We're talking about heat. We're talking about still having winter. Yeah, these are all important. Animals are very precisely tuned into the environment. And so when we make these dramatic shifts by climate change and the resulting disasters that are caused by climate change, we're impacting the way that animals live. We're drawing some animals into extinction. Tons of humans are having to relocate. And so my point with this is that we know that climate change is a thing that's happening. We care about all living things that live in these environments affected by climate change. And so we kind of have a moral duty or a responsibility with this knowledge to treat climate change as a serious issue. And that kind of perfectly segues or transitions us to talking about solutions. And one organization that I'm a bit familiar with is the National Park Service. Now, for those of you that don't know, the National Park Service is an organization with different parks throughout the entire country. And so we see a map of the United States, and each of these trees that we see, the symbol, is used to indicate where a national park is located. And you'll notice up here, that one is Voyageurs. That's where I work. And so the National Park Service, if you want to know what they're all about, we do have their mission statement here, which says the National Park Service preserves unimpaired the natural and cultural resources and values of the national park system for the enjoyment, the education, and inspiration of this and future generations. And so it's all about protecting the nature and the cultural resources in a park. And if you ever forget that, if you ever say, wait, why is the National Park Service a thing? Why do they exist? You can look at the emblem or the logo of the National Park Service, which is this arrowhead, and all of the things that it serves to protect are symbolized in this logo. So we have the mountains and the lakes representing the scenery and the waterways. We have the bison representing all of the wildlife and the ecology. We have the tree representing the plants and the vegetation. And also the shape of the arrowhead itself represents the cultural resources contained within the park. So again, if you ever forget what the National Park Service is all about, just take a look at the logo and you'll be reminded. And as you remember from just a moment ago, I showed that these parks are scattered throughout the United States, which means it has a number of different diverse types of landscapes and ecosystems within them. So this is just a small montage of kind of the display of different types of parks. Some of them are arid and dry deserts. Some of them are swampy, humid swamps like Everglades National Park. Some of them contain giant hotspots like Yellowstone, hotspot volcanoes. And so the really great thing about national parks being so widespread and so diverse is that the National Park Service is taking extra precautions to combat climate change in a variety of different types of landscapes. And so what I mean is the science is being conducted in each one of these places, which gives us a lot of understanding about how climate change operates in different types of environments. And so maybe we see how a specific type of plant responds to climate change in a dry environment versus one in a very humid environment, for example. And so national parks are like natural laboratories where very dedicated people are working together to combat climate change. And so the way that climate change is approached by the National Park Service is these 4 cornerstones. Okay, what I mean by that is these are like the most important ways to approach climate change. They're like the blueprint to approach climate change. And these 4 things are understand, adapt, mitigate, and communicate. And so some of these are kind of big words. I'll define them in just a moment, but we're going to go in order. So we're going to start with understand. Understand is a few things. It means to, one, be up to date or be in line with the most up-to-date science that has been released. And so part of that entails actual employees or scientists going out to these diverse landscapes and doing actual science. So maybe they're measuring the snow melt, maybe they're measuring the temperatures of the water, maybe they're taking measurements on the amount of animals in the specific area, the response to climate change. And so this is one, being up to date with the most up-to-date science regarding climate change, but it is also physically conducting the science because, again, national parks are like laboratories. Another cornerstone is to adapt. The word adapt means to change in response to an environment. And so sometimes, it's important to combat climate change as much as we can by reducing carbon dioxide. But another important thing is to be able to respond to it in the moment. And so adapt is all about understanding that climate change is a reality that we live in. There are natural disasters associated with it, and sometimes it demands an immediate response. And so an example of an adaptation is an Everglades National Park. As you can see in this picture, there are these eco tents, as they call them. And so these eco tents can be assembled and disassembled at need, knowing that climate change is accelerating the severity of tropical storms in an area. So these areas get flooded over a lot. So rather than having permanent structures there, which are constantly getting waterlogged or maybe knocked down, these eco tents are a nice way to adapt to the situation. Again, it's understanding climate change is a reality and responding to that. Mitigation is a really interesting one. I think it's a really important one. The word mitigate means to lessen or to make something less severe. And so adapting is important, responding to the immediate needs due to the reality of climate change. But mitigation is also really important. Mitigation is to lessen the carbon dioxide emissions in a few different ways. You'll notice nowadays that a lot of parks are using shuttle bus systems. And so, of course, shuttle buses still release carbon dioxide, but it's less carbon dioxide per person. So I don't know how many people fit in the shuttle bus. Let's just assume 15 or 20. So rather than having a bunch of different cars driving to a location, each one releasing carbon dioxide, now you just have one that is doing that. Likewise, you'll see that a lot of parks are offering bike lanes. And as you know, bikes release no carbon dioxide. Another way that you can mitigate climate change is through installation of solar panels. So the material that we use to generate the fossil fuels that we use to create carbon dioxide, which goes up in the atmosphere, is limited. There's only so much of that. Where solar panels use the energy from the sun to power buildings and structures like that. In fact, I worked at a national park before where their visitor center was operated by solar panels. And another way that you can mitigate or lessen the severity of climate change is really just through going through the regular old mission of the National Park Service and protecting the landscape. Because you'll notice in these pictures, I have a giant sequoia tree. This is in Kings Canyon National Park in California. And we have a nice wetland in Biscayne National Park in Florida. You'll remember from a moment ago, the carbon cycle. And some of the main players that we really want to protect in order to combat climate change are plants and wetlands. And so by just going through the regular old mission of protecting the park, we are mitigating, we are helping to mitigate in that we are protecting these plants and wetlands, which are so important for removing that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And these trees and these wetlands, they're so massive, they're really like powerhouses. We really want them on our team. And the last cornerstone that the National Park Service takes is to communicate. And this is really important because the National Park Service, having so many sites over such a vast area, means that we get literally millions and millions of visitors coming each year. These are people from all different backgrounds from across the country and also throughout the world. When I worked in the national parks, we had some parks that got more international visitors than even people from the US. And so it's really important that we're able to communicate all of the science in a very effective way. And so the way that this is done is you'll see now that there are many park ranger talks specifically about climate change and climate change in that national park, where it invites the public to kind of have a dialogue where we talk about the impacts of climate change in that park. So it kind of opens up that discussion. Another thing is through internships, and there's a variety of them. You can work for an internship and work in a beautiful national park, and oftentimes do the science, but also learn how to communicate the science that you're doing. For example, Voyageurs National Park, where I work, hosts interns that we call field fellows. And so field fellows will often go out into the field, conduct real science where they're taking measurements, and often they'll have an opportunity to communicate the science to the public. Additionally, there are internships like scientists in the park, and this is another similar one. In fact, I just included this picture because that's me from 7 years ago, very excitedly holding a dinosaur skull. So I was giving a presentation about that. And oftentimes these scientists in the park positions are exclusively about communication. And a large part of that is through climate change. So when I worked as an intern scientist in the park, I gave plenty of different types of presentations, but a big part of that was climate change. Yeah, so those are great ways to get involved for young students. A lot of times the interns that come are young students. People are very passionate and really want to help in this fight against climate change. So I figured I'll give some specific examples that are happening at Voyageurs National Park, which is again where I work. And so Voyageurs National Park again is located in Minnesota. If you know anything about Minnesota, you'll know one, that it has a ton of lakes, and you'll also know that it gets really super cold in the winter. And so what happens is the lakes will freeze over. And if you're from the Midwest or you're from Minnesota, you probably know this. You probably grew up with this. But for me, I was very shocked by this. I'm not from this area. And I am still surprised to this day that you can drive a car out on this ice. That's how thick it's supposed to get. And being cold, where I live specifically, there's tons of ice fishing that you can do. You can set up a shanty and you drive your car out to it. It's a huge part of living in this area in the winter. But unfortunately, this winter, we barely had any ice. There were moments where it would freeze over and you could take the car out, and then a few weeks later, there would be a warning sign that closes off the lake because it's too thin, because it's too warm. And so the lake was not that frozen. I spent a large chunk of my winter here, and for a large portion of it, the lake was not frozen. And this is an issue in many ways. The fact that the lakes are staying warmer. One specific study that I like to talk about is one that was done on cold water fish. We'll talk about Cisco, lake whitefish, and lake trout. Now, if you don't know much about fish, you might imagine that all fish are just swimming around in the lake and it doesn't matter where they are. But some fish like very specific zones of the lake. These fish that I have on the screen specifically like cold waters. So what I have here is a diagram showing the type of zone that these cold water fish are able to thrive in. So you notice it's right in the middle. They're hanging out, they're happy. The water too high up or too close to the surface is too warm for them. The water that's too low has too little oxygen. And so just how us humans breathe in oxygen to survive, fish also need oxygen to survive. Of course, we breathe in air and they breathe it in the water. And so this water down here has too little oxygen. That means if they spent too much time down there, they would suffocate in a way. And so these fish like to live in this kind of middle zone where the temperatures are just cold enough for them to thrive. Well, what we're seeing now with climate change is that both of these zones that they don't like are getting increasingly larger. And so what I mean by that is this warm water that they like to stay away from, that zone is now getting bigger because the temperatures are getting warmer, and that increases uh, the surface level of the water that's closest to the surface. So it's making that ceiling kind of come crushing down. Likewise, it's promoting the growth of algae on the top. And as that algae grows and as that algae dies, it trickles down to the very bottom of that lake. And when it's dead on the bottom of the lake and it decomposes, it sucks in that oxygen that is down in the bottom of the depths. And so, therefore, it's making the bottom layer of the lake have less oxygen. So it's affecting it in two ways. It's making the ceiling of the lake, if you will, kind of come down this way. It's making the bottom of the lake come up this way, and it's essentially shrinking the zone in which these fish, these cold water fish, like to live in. And this is true with any animal. If you take an animal and you reduce the amount of area in which it can live in, it produces a lot of struggles for that animal. That animal now has less space, it has less resources, it has more competition, and many animals go extinct this way. Um, and as we know, when you affect one animal in an ecosystem, it doesn't just affect that animal. It affects the animal that eats that animal. It affects the animal that eats that animal. And so our ecosystem is very intricately, it's an intricate web of connections. And so to wipe out any entire species really is a negative thing. And so what is being done? How is Voyageurs National Park responding to this? Well, there are members on our team that go out and do the actual science. You'll see a lot of these four pillars or these four cornerstones we talked about before: understand, adapt, mitigate, communicate, being done here. A lot of what is going on is measurements of the water temperature in the lakes are being conducted. So we're creating a plan, seeing how much the temperature has changed in the water. We know from science, we know what temperatures these fish enjoy to be in, and we're monitoring. That is, we're actively going out and taking measurements. We're taking measurements of the water to make sure that they can thrive. In extreme instances where these lakes are warming up too much, they will actually be transported to another lake that has better conditions. And so that is a form of adaptation. Again, it's responding immediately to the unfortunate consequences of climate change. Another thing is invasive species in the area, which are animals that are not native to that area, that have come into the area, are now taking up the resources. There are acts to take them out, really just providing the best environment that these fish need in order to survive, given the unfortunate circumstance due to climate change. And another thing that, and I realize I'm running a little short on time, maybe fast forward through this a little bit. But another really important thing that is being done at Voyageurs National Park are projects like the Voyageurs Wetland Restoration Project. And so wetlands are these giant areas with lots of vegetation, and it turns out to be home to a number of different types of animals. And these wetlands, unfortunately, on top of climate change, they have a number of other issues like those invasive species that I talked about. So an example of that are these specific types of cattails. They're not native to the area. They block out native plants for being able to grow, and it's affecting the animals that depend on those plants. And so the Voyageurs Wetland Restoration Project involves a lot of things. For one, it involves a ton of machinery to go in and physically remove those invasive species. And essentially, the kind of idea behind the Voyageurs Wetland Restoration Project is it is removing all of the harmful things being done in that area to give the animals that live there the best fighting chance that they have knowing that they're going to have to deal with climate change. So again, providing the best environment, giving them the most chance they can possibly have in order to succeed. And I do want to take maybe 2 minutes or so for you to think about this and to type some answers into the chat, because we learned how the National Park Service is working together to combat climate change. But I'm curious what ideas that you all have. How can you contribute to combating climate change? You can type this into the chat. And to kind of provide you with a guide, I want you to think under terms of these 4 cornerstones that we talked about. So is this something you can do to understand the science? That is, maybe in the future, you want to really study plants, and maybe you can see how plants are responding to climate change. Maybe you're interested in engineering, and you want to think about different facilities that can respond very quickly to climate change, to escape the disasters, or maybe to mitigate in order to not contribute as much carbon dioxide into the air. Or maybe you like science communication, whether it's working for a national park or a nonprofit. Maybe you like being kind of the messenger, taking these complex concepts in science and communicating it in an effective way to the public. And so, yeah, if you have any contributions or any ideas, whether it's something you want to do in the present or something you'd like to do in the future when you're an adult, ways that you can contribute or ways you can help to combating climate change. Give maybe a minute or so, because I do want to leave room for questions as well. Oh, that's a great one. Thank you, Tanner. Communicate and organize with community members. I love this answer. A great reminder that brings up a great point. A lot of our impacts in combating climate change come from community. How do you organize people in your local community? What are people doing to organize in an effective way to make a meaningful contribution? We can't do it on our own. And so I really love that answer for that reason. Electric cars, that's another great answer. As we know that a lot of the cars we use today are actively dumping carbon dioxide into the air, but electric cars don't do that. Yep, plants different types of vegetation. Again, we really want to support plants. Plants are on our team. They're actively removing the stuff that is thickening our heat trapping blanket. I'll give maybe another 30 seconds or so, because I want to leave room for questions, of course. Use less power, excellent, and find a different source. Very good. Yeah, use less power is mitigating. We are actively not putting as much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and also to find a different source. Very good. Yeah, a lot of the fossil fuels that we use to burn in order to create energy are limited after all. So I think eventually we will have to really switch the way that we think about using energy. All right, those are great answers. Thank you so much for contributing. I do like to kind of reel it back in and tie a nice bow around this, because it really was so much info. I appreciate you sticking through. For this presentation, we learned all about climate change and also how it relates to national parks. We learned that climate change is the increase in average global temperature over long periods of time. And we see that there's no mistaking the temperature is going up and up and up, further demonstrated by the fact that we've had the top 10 hottest global years on record within the last 10 years. We learned how climate change happens by relating it to a heat trapping blanket. When we burn fossil fuels to use a lot of our modern day conveniences it emits carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which thickens a blanket around us, which ultimately heats our planet. We also distinguish the difference between regular carbon dioxide versus rampant carbon dioxide. Regular carbon dioxide is balanced out by this beautiful carbon cycle, where rampant carbon dioxide is throwing more into the cycle and it's overwhelming it. We talked a little bit about why this all matters. We know that climate change is happening. We know it's impacting the environments which wildlife and humans alike live within. And we have a moral duty to protect these environments, knowing the realities of climate change. We talked about some solutions, such as what the National Park Service is doing. The National Park Service protects and preserves a number of different landscapes across the country, and we learned that national parks are natural laboratories, places where you can do science which can be applied globally. We learned the four cornerstones behind the national park combating climate change, which is to understand the science, adapt to the situation, mitigate or lessen the severity, as well as to effectively communicate the science to the public. We then went over some direct examples, such as in Voyageurs National Park, dealing with understanding how cold water fish are suffering due to climate change and how we can work to help them out, as well as projects like the Voyageurs Wetland Restoration Project, which actively removes invasive species in order to give the animals that live in these vast wetlands the best chance that they have in order to succeed. We then finally wrapped it up with talking about personal ways that we can work together to combat climate change. And a big part of this, a big kind of message I want to send out to this is that it really is a community effort. And so we should use less power. We should switch to metal water bottles and switch to bikes and things like that. These are important. But if we really want to make a meaningful impact, understanding this as a community effort really is so crucial. Again, that was a lot of information. I appreciate you, one, being interested enough in the subject to attend, and also for you contributing your answers and your curiosity. I hope this has encouraged you to think about climate change and the different ways that you can work together to combat global climate change. Thank you all so much, and I'll stick around for any questions that you have.
Jesse, it does look like there's a question from St. Joseph School saying 2.7 degrees hotter over the last, how many years did that number come up?
Yeah, that's a good question. I actually don't know off the top of my head. I'm going to pull up the graph and see if I can kind of figure it out just by looking at it. Oops. That's a good question. I actually don't know that answer off the top of my head. But what I will do is, and I do this with any virtual lesson or any lesson that I have, I do jot it down and I look into it, and I will get an answer for Lori. Thank you so much. That's a really good question.
We have one more minute left, Jesse. I dropped in the chat. I think that the adaptations from the Everglades with kind of the tents that are movable is just amazing. And I know for the St. Croix National Scenic Riverway, like Voyageurs, we're doing a lot of monitoring. Are there any adaptations that you're aware of that some of the Midwest parks are actually going to start implementing? Or are we still a little safer because we're further north than, say, the Everglades?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know any specific examples of things that are happening. And you do bring up a good point. Because of the national parks and really any area that's along the coastal area, they'll have a lot more of an immediate recognition of the impacts of climate change, where we definitely see them over here in the Midwest, but maybe it's not as much in our face in the same kind of way. Like I mentioned, we notice the lakes aren't freezing as much and the animals are suffering. So there is that, but it's not as severe. So I'm not sure of any specific examples of ways that uh, anything along the lines of like an eco tent. Um, but that's a good question. I'm also jotting that one down, and I'll send it out to you if I find out the answer.
Well, thank you, everyone. We are at lunchtime. So thank you, Jesse, for the great information, the charts, the maps, all of that helps my brain to really learn this. So enjoy lunch, and we will see you back this afternoon. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. Take care.